Thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for focusing on the topic. At least according to the CCP, my last name rhymes with rascal, so if you can call me Cleo, that's helpful. I'm going to talk a little bit about this very vast region, and I'm going to go back beyond World War II. We sort of know the story of World War II, but the U.S. in the Pacific before World War II really sets the stage for understanding how important this has been to the U.S. for at least 2 centuries. And it's going to, I hope, help a little bit decolonize the mental strategic map that we have. A big part of the problem is that the American strategic community is literally uses a Eurocentric map. So Oleg, if we could put up that first map, please. So if you went to school at a time when there were actual maps up on the wall, you might have thought it was North America centered, but it was actually centered on Europe, and the dominant ocean was the Atlantic. This is National Geographic's map, not the Royal Geographical Society, but U.S. National Geographic's map. As you can see, it's actually Europe that's physically at the center of the map, and the dominant ocean is the Atlantic Ocean. And in many ways, that's shaped our way of looking at the world. The Pacific is literally at the edges of the map. It's hard to understand how it bridges North America to Asia or what's in that Pacific. It sort of shaped us, and we see it also in strategic thought. If you've done any courses on the history of geopolitics or anything like that, you'll be very familiar with the next map. Next one, please, which is Mackinder's geographical pivot of history. This theory, the heartland theory, is that whoever controls that pivot area, which is basically the kind of the Volga to the Yangtze to the Arctic to the Himalayas, controls what Mackinder called the world island. Now, the world island was Europe, Asia, and Africa. The idea was that that pivot area controlled 50% of resources known at the time. This dates from 1904. And so engagement in that area, control in that area, was critical for controlling the direction of the world. He called it that region the geographical pivot of history. Whoever had control over that area could expand out from there and have extensive control. There are a few things from a North American perspective and from a modern perspective that don't quite make sense. First of all, as you can see, North America isn't really considered that critical. It's part of this outer crescent. But also, there was an assumption that what was behind the pivot was what Mackinder called an icy wall. So that area was backed up against something that nobody could get at them from. The Arctic was not considered strategically important. And we saw that during the Russo-Japanese War, around the same time, 1904, 1905, the Baltic Fleet had to get from Russia to Japan, and it had to go west past the UK, down the Horn of Africa, and then all the way along in order to get to Japan. It took about 8 or 9 months to get to Japan. By the time this fleet got there, it was covered in barnacles, the men were exhausted, and they were destroyed very quickly. Now, you can, during certain times of the year, and depending on on your naval assets, you can get across the Pacific from that area, from the Russian Arctic, very quickly into the Northern Pacific. So it's changed that part of the strategic map. But this is still, you will still hear people talk about the geographical pivot of history, Mackinder's heartland, how important it is. But it's a very Eurocentric view. This is important to Europe. It's not necessarily important to America. And America knew it from very early on. Next slide, please. In 1938 to 1942, the U.S. sent out an exploring expedition. It's also known as the XX, and it collected samples and did ethnographic studies. It discovered Antarctic. We hear a lot about Cook's voyages and a lot of those European voyages of discovery, but this was an extraordinary American one that was one of the biggest of the area, and its goal was to understand the Pacific. And so a lot of the samples from that expedition ended up in the Smithsonian, and this is a quote from Smithsonian Magazine. Besides establishing a stronger diplomatic presence throughout the Pacific, the expedition sought to provide much-needed charts to American whalers, sealers, and China traders. Decades before America surveyed and mapped its own interior, this government-sponsored voyage of discovery would enable a new determined nation to take its first tentative steps towards becoming an economic world power. There was understanding that the economic future of the United States was in the Pacific, understanding and being comfortable in the Pacific. Next slide, please. And you saw the development that going there. The sort of push of manifest destiny didn't stop at the western coast. And there was a very quick development in the 19th century. So California was admitted as a state in 1850. Alaska was purchased in 1867. Transcontinental Railway was completed in 69. Hawaii was annexed in 1898. And then the Spanish-American War came also in 1898, where the United States took possession of the Philippines and Guam. This is a particularly interesting. The Spanish-American War is critically important for understanding what the U.S. wasn't. When the U.S. beat Spain, it took the Philippines and it took Guam, but there was a whole series of other islands in the Pacific that belonged to Spain, including the Caroline Islands, parts of what's now the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. And the U.S. didn't take it. The U.S. wanted what it needed for logistical reach and trade primarily, which was the issue with, partially with the Philippines. But it didn't want to become the sort of colonial power that was developing at the time. So those islands that the U.S. didn't take, Spain sold to Germany, which was very much of a colonial power. This is the map of U.S. possessions from around that period. And you can see they're kind of scattered all the way across, mostly small, including, by the way, the excellent harbor at Pago Pago in American Samoa. But it wasn't, except for the Philippines, it's this sort of attempt to colonially grab the whole heart of it. And the importance of all of this was reinforced, next slide, please, when Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet into the Pacific. And he said, in my own judgment, the most important service that I rendered to peace was the voyage of the battle fleet around the world. I had become convinced that for many reasons it was essential that we should have it clearly understood by our own people especially, but also by other peoples, that the Pacific was as much our home waters as the Atlantic. So this understanding of the importance of the Pacific, it's 200 years old as you go, from the XX, you know that, but President Roosevelt made it very clear. And if you look at the route of the Great White Fleet, he stopped at all these places which had just become part of America. Hawaii, Pago Pago, Australia, New Zealand, but then Philippines and on up. It was really kind of saying, we're here to stay. Then World War I came. And if you remember, I mentioned that Spain sold some of its territories to the Germans. And what happened during World War I was the Japanese moved in and took those German possessions. Next slide, please. And so you had a situation, this is a little bit maybe unclear for some people to see, but where you had the United States in sort of the top right, that's the Hawaiian Islands, and you had the United States over to the left with the Philippines. But in between the Philippines and the United States was this massive Japanese mandate in the Central Pacific. So it expanded down from Japan through that whole Central Pacific area. So that's now what is Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. Those were places the U.S. did not take in the Spanish-American War, but Japan did, and it set up to colonize them. It set up to make them part of Japan. So the civilian headquarters for that region was Koror. It had more Japanese than Palauans living there. There were schools, health clinics, a lot of economic development. It became very much part of Japan, and it was closed largely to the outside world. But there was a lot of concern that this could become a strategic problem. For example, Pete Ellis from the Marines went to Palau to go take a look. He went across the region and he wrote what became the basis for the island hopping campaign. But he did that in the early 20s. So 20 years before the war started, people knew that this was going to be a problem. And at the same time, Billy Mitchell was in the 30s, was up in Alaska saying Alaska is going to be critical also. And when I talk about the Pacific, I am including that whole center from the Aleutians down through the Central Pacific to argue that if the U.S. doesn't have at least strategic denial over that area, it is at risk. And we saw that in World War II. Next slide, please. So what happened in World War II was Japan could hit the U.S. from that core, that center of the Pacific, that heartland of this geopolitical pivot. And the U.S. had a very hard time getting to Japan because it had the buffer of the Central Pacific, and the U.S. military had to come down through the south and fight its way back up through what Captain Fennell was describing, the battles of Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound, Tarawa, Macon, to finally get to the Japanese-held territories in what's now Marshall Islands, Kwajalein, Federated States of Micronesia, Truk Lagoon, Peleliu, and Palau, and then work towards Saipan, which is Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, and then finally be able to set up the airfields in Tinian in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, where the waves of B-29s could go off and hit Japan. And ultimately, it was a B-29, the Enola Gay, that took off from Tinian and dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and started the process of the end of the war. Japan knew as soon as it lost Saipan that the U.S. was within striking distance, and it was considered its inner defense perimeter, and it was probably heading towards the end. The understanding of the importance of the control over that region, or at least strategic denial, and the cost that it took in human lives and in suffering of the locals was tremendous. I would argue just because there was a misunderstanding of the importance of the center of the map. Next slide, please. After the war, the exact same area that was the Japanese mandate reverted to the UN, and the UN Security Council gave it to the United States, specifically the Navy, to administer as the only strategic trust territory. As you can see from the map in the upper left-hand corner, it covers an area that's almost the size of the continental United States, very large. The U.S., again, it really is an uncomfortable colonial power. And in the 60s, it set up the Congress of Micronesia with representatives from across the region, local representatives, so that they could discuss how to move forward. But the underlying red line for the U.S. was this region cannot be in a position again where a hostile power can use it to hit the U.S. The negotiations went ahead, and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas decided to join the United States. So next slide, please. So this is the current map. Everything in dark blue is what currently belongs to the United States, including the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is to the left and just above Guam. And you can see that's where the U.S. and Japan share a maritime boundary. That's how far into the Pacific the United States is. The CNMI, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, is the closest U.S. location to China. It's about 1,600 miles from China, and obviously kind of even closer to Taiwan. The rest of that zone, what became those three countries, next slide, please, Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, they became independent, but they entered into this agreement with the U.S., which is unlike anything the U.S. has ever agreed before. It was agreed on the U.S. side because it didn't want to be a colonial power, but it also couldn't afford any other hostile control in the area. So these three countries entered into what's called the Compact of, each of them have their own Compact of Free Association with the United States. Next slide, please. It has a lot of elements to it, but for what we're talking about, this was the core of it. Independent countries, but the government of the United States has full authority and responsibility for security and defense matters in or relating to Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. So this is how the U.S. got the strategic denial that in the center of the Pacific, that if it had had it before World War II, history might have gone a very different way. So the men and women who negotiated this on both sides, because the people of those locations also didn't want to become a battlefield again, made this incredible complex agreement to try to secure the center of the Pacific. Next slide, please. This agreement it's really unique. So people they're called the freely associated states, these three countries. They can live and work in the U.S. without a problem, as long as they don't have criminal issues. They can and do at very high rates serve in the U.S. military. This picture is a picture of the post office in Koror and Palau. Remember, it's an independent country, but it has the U.S. flag at the same size as the Palauan flag because it is considered domestic mail. And one of my concerns actually with what's happening with Doge in the post office is somebody might not understand how important this element of post office support to the region is, because this is what enables them, for example, to order off Amazon, to send packages back and forth with relatives. It is the post office is an incredibly important symbol of that linkage between the U.S. and these three U.S. freely associated states. So that's something to keep an eye on. Their school system is synchronized to the U.S. system, so moving back and forth makes it a lot easier for the families and students. They can study at U.S. state universities at in-state rates. Their appliances have U.S. voltages and plugs. They're not members of the Commonwealth. They use American spelling. They drive on the right. They have access to U.S. weather services, FAA, and other government services. And again, as those are being cut or adjusted, awareness of what this might do in the FAS is going to be incredibly important. No other countries in the world have this sort of thing, and certainly not in the Pacific. So when we talk about the Pacific Islands, these three countries are totally different. And as Captain Fennell said, this was a relationship bought in blood and out of respect for the people of those countries that suffered the last time around, and this time it's essential to make sure that persists. A peculiarity of this is that all of this is under the Department of the Interior, which is why it's interesting because Secretary Burgum, who's Secretary of Interior now, is on the NSC because of the energy security. And it would be perhaps very helpful if his role was expanded to include oversight over the relationship between the U.S. territories of Guam and CNMI and the FAS, and to ensure that Chinese activities there aren't undermining U.S. strategic interests. That office, Secretary of the Interior, is actually the front line of defending U.S. strategic interests and the relationships with the countries of the Central Pacific. He's already on the NSC. It would be great if that could be expanded to include preserving and protecting this relationship and promoting this relationship. Next slide, please. If you take a look at the strategic map, a very traditional kinetic map, if you're a planner sitting in Indo-Pacific, for example, or the Pentagon, you look at this, you've got all these U.S. territories in dark blue. You've got the freely associated states in a little bit lighter. 2 out of the 3 of them recognize Taiwan, which gives them an added layer of protection. That means there's no Chinese embassy, so no Chinese forward operating location. And then you've got this turquoise color that is the defense, the treaty allies. So it looks like you're okay. Next slide, please. And Mr. Gaffney talked about the first and second, and then, of course, there is a third island chain that we talk about a lot, these north-south chains. But actually, if you look at it sort of how we're looking at it here, and you understand that it's the Central Pacific that's important, it's this east-west corridor of freedom, including freedom of navigation, that allows you to get to the first and second island chain that are what's critically important. And this was the problem that the U.S. had in the lead up to World War II. It had also focused off the coast of Asia. It had focused on Philippines and Guam were fine without realizing that, that whole center of the Pacific is not fine, and being able to get to Philippines and Guam isn't going to be possible. So they're going to suffer several years of horrific occupation. But that was corrected after the war through these compacts of free association. And if you're a planner, you seem like you're okay. However, next slide, please. China also is very concerned about the first and second island chain. And this is from the PLA Navy handbook from around 15 years ago. They're very focused on it. So what they've been doing is, okay, we understand the U.S. kinetic map. We fight in a different way. We use unrestricted warfare. We're going to use all sorts of agreements and elite capture and strategic corruption to gain influence within countries and to be in a position to basically hop the chain and do what the U.S. did during World War II. During World War II, in the kinetic map, the center of the Pacific was too hard for the U.S. So the U.S. had to come up through the bottom and then come hit it from behind as it was trying to degrade it internally. The Chinese are doing the same thing, and there's a very good paper by Toshi Yoshihara about how the PLA has studied the World War II map maps and the US and Japan and have learned and adapted from it. Next slide, please. So in 2022, while we had this blue kinetic map and everything looked fine, during COVID, Wang Yi went to visit the region with some agreements. And these are the countries in red where all of the restrictions that had been in place since the start of COVID were dropped just to let him come in, him and his delegation come in. To me, that's a proxy for understanding how much influence they had to get them to not only to want to, but to get them to drop their health restrictions that people couldn't come home for funerals. But Wang Yi could come in for a 2-day photo op and talking to people in these countries. So you can see through all of the things that Mr. Gaffney and Captain Fennell talked about, this kind of strategic corruption, they got right in and they've jumped the first and second island chain. Next slide, please. So just to give you kind of a visual for it, this is the view from Mount Tapachao. A lot of Marines died in order to recapture or capture Mount Tapachao from Japanese forces. And when you look out from it, if you look offshore, you see that U.S. kinetic map with the pre-positioning ships offshore. So each of those 3 ships is provisioned to help in a case of HADR or fight a small war for 30 days. They've got everything you need. So if you're a planner and you look out there, you pat yourself on the back. Meanwhile, right in the downtown of the capital of the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, you have this massive Chinese-backed casino. It's closed, but it's just gone into, it has a very complex legal history, and the FBI has raided it. Nothing has happened. At one point, a former CIA director and a former FBI director on Louis Free and Woolsey were both on the board of, or the advisory board of this casino. Charges haven't been brought, even though all the files, but a lot of files have been taken out. And the money that's flowed into the system, this casino at one point was running more money than the casinos in Macau directly into the US banking system. And it was almost exclusively Chinese gamblers who were there. It distorted the politics and economics of the region. And you have a situation now where the delegate from the CNMI to the US Congress is pushing for a lifting of the caps on direct flights from mainland China so more Chinese can come into the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. Chinese now who come into the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas on short-term visas or on short-term visits do not need a visa. There's a kind of very basic EVS TAP thing they have to fill out, but they do not need a visa. It's the only part of the US they do not need a visa. And they're not supposed to leave the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, but at least in the hundreds, they are illegally taking boats and going to Guam. Some have been found on U.S. military bases. They're involved in sales and manufacture of drugs. Within the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, the woman that ran the Bureau of Motor Vehicles was convicted of selling U.S. driver's licenses to Chinese, and they were using false U.S. identity documents. It is a huge gap in a U.S. understanding of the strategic importance of this area. And it is facilitated, and this is again something Captain Fennell mentioned, by economic distress. They need different economic options so that the people who are saying the only economic option for us is Chinese tourists are shown for what they are, which is not being willing to go after all these other options. And I think that in some cases, actually, some of those other options are deliberately at least slowed down or ignored by those who are pushing for the Chinese tourists only option. The governor of CNMI has been repeatedly requesting FBI investigators, Treasury, to come in and clean up Doge, whatever it is. There is a lot of money missing from the last administration in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, and he wants it cleaned up. And this is the core of it. If we don't go after the strategic corruption in places like the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is the United States of America, and so it's not difficult, then that whole geographical pivot of history that cost so many lives the last time around is going to turn increasingly red. The Chinese will be able to go down from the bottom like we've seen and increasingly corrupting those into the heartland, and again be in a position to cut off the Americans who are in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, Guam, American Samoa, and make it very difficult for the U.S. to get across. Whoever controls that heartland of the America's real geographical pivot of history is in a position to strike a dagger into the heart of U.S. defense and security. Next slide, please. This slide comes from Captain Fennell, just to show that the Chinese are not messing around. On the left is certain kind of naval assets in 2000, then naval assets 10 years later. I don't know if he's updated the map, but even this gives you a sense of how they're building up. And in 2008, Admiral Keating, who is then commander of PACOM, told the Senate Armed Services Committee that a senior Chinese officer suggested to him, you take Hawaii East, we'll take Hawaii West. We'll share information, we'll save you all the trouble of deploying your naval forces west of Hawaii. This is something that President Roosevelt would have identified immediately as a very serious problem. What happened to the U.S. during World War II was a failure to understand the importance of this geographic pivot of history to the U.S. But U.S. strategic understanding of this goes back at least 200 years, and we're going to need to go back to that in order to put the pieces in place to be able to defend the Americans who live in the area and the people of the freely associated states who have been such help and support to the U.S. during and since World War II, and to ensure that their security and U.S. security and prosperity is viable. Next slide, please. This is how you say thank you in Chamorro. Chamorro is the language of the people of Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. It is an American language, and I highly recommend you go out and visit. It is a beautiful part of the United States of America, and it would be great if we got more American tourists rather than Chinese tourists. And if you want to bring business along and help build up the economy, even better.
You showed on that image of the view of Saipan 3 pre-positioning ships packed to the gunnels with lots of equipment and food and medicine and other things needed to essentially support combat operations, all of which it appears are in line of sight of a facility owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party. That would seem to be a bad place to be parking these vessels if that's a permanent anchorage. Is that the case? And if so, what on earth are we thinking?
I have no idea. I mean, it's worse than that. The crew of those ships spends a lot of time on shore. Kids in Saipan will say, we know something bad's happened somewhere in the world if the ships are gone. There's just this implicit assumption that everything is covered, that this region is secure, that underpins a lot of or has underpinned, I'm hoping it's changing now, and I think it is, a lot of the planning. There was Tinian, where those North Fields, where the North Field is, where the Enola Gay and all those B-29s took off from. Tinian is very close to Saipan, just you can see it. There's major military investments, at least in the hundreds of millions probably at this point, going in to rehabilitate those fields as a divert airfield. And it's a small island. Not a lot of people live there. And right on the dual use port, the little port where a lot of the equipment comes in and people come and go, the only building on that port is another little Chinese casino. Chinese linked casino. I mean, this is tricky, right? Because people will say, well, it's just a business, so we need business, so we need employees and all that stuff. And one of the issues is China's own 2017 national intelligence law, which says that any Chinese individual or Chinese company has to support Chinese intelligence efforts, or it can be punished or rewarded. If there is one Chinese national that's involved in that casino, and there are, then that's an issue, and it's right there. Everything is going past it. You don't know what's going on. It has a hotel affiliated with it. The reports are it closed. Now, I've heard recently in the last few days that there's still some activity going on there, so I don't know what's going on. And that's another problem, is you really need to be there and have the trust of locals in order to get a sense of what's going on, because this, what Colonel Newsham was described about the Chinese strategic corruption and engagement in the region has created an atmosphere of fear locally. People, they're very tight-knit communities, and if you have one person in your extended family who had financial problems, could even wanted to pay for the healthcare of their parents or education of their kids, could have had perfectly fine motives, but ended up going into business with Chinese interests that have interests that are not aligned with U.S. interests, it can rip apart a family. And people who are on the wrong side of that already are ending up with their tires slashed, sometimes finding it difficult to get a job, socially ostracized. There are incredible Americans and Palauans and Marshallese and Micronesians who are fighting this fight, and it is tough. They are putting themselves individually in the way of Chinese expansion into the geographical pivot of American history. And if they don't get what they need to defend themselves, and all of it's stuff we should be doing anyways if we believe in transparency, accountability, human rights, rule of law, going after those casinos, going after that money, then you end up with all these pieces of very odd Chinese investments in strategically located places. This thing about the Tinian in Saipan, the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas has a population of about 40 or 50,000 people. This should be possible to figure out economic development with the support of the American government. The way I look at it is block and build. You have to block the Chinese. And I also like the Filipino term, illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive, ICAD. Illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive Chinese activity. Yet that has to be blocked at the same time as you build up these economic alternatives so that people can live.
Cleo, when we talk about many of these islands for which we have assumed, as you pointed out, full authority and responsibility, they're technically not American islands, at least in some cases. One that you mentioned that is, as I understand it, really crucial to our defense plans in the Western Pacific is a full-on American territory, Guam. You mentioned, I think, people coming from some of the neighboring islands without visas, without authorization, winding up in sensitive facilities. How would you characterize the security situation on that bit of American real estate specifically, and also the opportunity that it creates to move from there into the United States proper?
It's a major problem, and Guam's representative to Congress, Representative Moylan, has publicly asked for help to deal with this. There are a lot of people in the region who know their countries or territories better than anybody else, like David Penuelo, former President Penuelo in the Federated States of Micronesia, President Whips in Palau, Congressman Moylan, who are saying we need help. And apart from the physical infiltration, of course, Guam was targeted by Volt Typhoon, the cyber penetration of its critical infrastructure. And there's some say that China wants to not have to go kinetic, but if it does, if there's an aggressive attack on Taiwan, I could see it trying to be in a position to completely debilitate Guam, CNMI, any of those striking capacities before they can get off the ground. So and we've seen it. It's horrible to think about, but for example, in Afghanistan, what the Taliban did when they came in was they started killing the pilots, the U.S. trained pilots who had the capability to use what the U.S. had left behind to counter them. And you want to make sure that not only are your airfields secure, your airplanes are secure, but also that your people are secure because they will be targeted. There will be the Chinese undoubtedly have a list of all of the key strategic people, so to speak, in Guam, in Commonwealth and Northern Marianas, and as you know, because of comprehensive national powers approach from Beijing, that definition of strategic is very wide, and it's better for them to get to the person and then be in a position to use the infrastructure for themselves later on. Than to so I think the point of this is I think apart from all of the kinetic warfare discussions that Captain Fennell, for example, discusses so eloquently, and why we need to rebuild the Navy and rebuild the industrial base, we also need to look at this completely different battlefield, which is this unrestricted warfare battlefield, which includes political warfare, that's allowed them to be in a position to jump that first and second island chain. And anytime anybody talks about the first or second island chain, if they also don't talk about securing that east-west corridor of freedom that allows the first and second island chain to exist, they forgot the message of World War II, which was you can have the Philippines and you can have Guam, but if you can't get there, it doesn't mean anything.
Cleo, one other thing that I don't think you touched on, but if you did, I may have missed it, but could you just amplify on a point that we often hear when we talk about this part of the world, and particularly the threat that it now faces from the Chinese Communist Party, kinetic or pre-kinetic, and that is the importance of our allies in contributing to, well, deterrence in the first instance, and if it comes to it, the kind of correlation of forces. You mentioned comprehensive national power. You might say a further word about that too. But how does say Australia or New Zealand play, if at all, in sort of helping us with this pivot of history region that they're a lot closer to than we are?
I would argue that they're not. This is the U.S., so they're way down at the bottom. They have, in the same way that we've got this Eurocentrism in our head, there has been a very effective PR campaign by Australia and New Zealand to present themselves as being key to the Pacific Islands. As you saw from the presentation, they have no history in the Central Pacific. This, if you're from Yap, your great-grandfather would have spoken Spanish, your grandfather German, your father Japanese, and you speak English. There's no Australia or New Zealand involved in there at all. The islands that are critical for Australia and New Zealand's security are below the equator, and that was one of the reasons why the Americans went down there initially. Also, Guadalcanal, for example, is to make sure that those supply lines to Australia and New Zealand were kept open. If you noticed, all that red on the map, those are areas where Australia and New Zealand said to the U.S., don't worry, we have it covered. They clearly don't. They put out press releases. I mean, you just saw, for example, with the Cook Islands, which is Cook Islanders hold New Zealand passports, New Zealand citizenship. But there's this fiction that it's an independent country, which was reinforced by the Biden administration, which said that it was an independent country. And that gave it the maneuverability to go and sign a deal with China. In the case of Solomon Islands, you have a very pro-PRC government that the Australians are giving over $100 million to them for policing. Their police minister owns a company in Singapore with a Chinese national and the son of the Solomon Islands prime minister who flipped the country from Taiwan to China. As far as I'm concerned, and a lot of that Chinese corruption money that flows through that region ends up, the leaders, they'll take the money from China. They don't want to spend it in China. They buy property on the gold, in Australia and New Zealand. They use Australian banks, New Zealand banks to launder their money until the Australians and New Zealanders start going after that Chinese corruption money that is undermining security in the Southern Pacific and that is being laundered through their financial systems. I don't take any of their protestations about how useful they are as an ally seriously.
You started this presentation, which again was extremely impressive, with a remark that was made to one of our former commanders of what I think at the time was called Pacific.
Pacific Command.
Yeah. The Pacific would be, bifurcated, with China taking west of Hawaii, with us being responsible for east of Hawaii. And for reasons that I think you've amply demonstrated, there's a lot more interesting things in the west of Hawaii. But
there are Americans west of Hawaii.
Yeah, exactly. Could you just talk a little bit about having leapt even further, arguably, past that third island chain, I guess, Hawaii, to the west coast of South America, and building now huge ports and installations there with the Belt and Road Initiative moniker that would enable them to cut our supply lines from, our own hemisphere, as opposed to fighting it out in the Central Pacific. How does all of that bear on the pivot you're talking about?
I'm very grateful for the question. Chinese activity doesn't teleport from China to Latin America. It goes through the Pacific. It's all about that. In that context, I'd underline the role of American Samoa, which is the only part of the U.S. in the Southern Hemisphere, and it is right there in between China and Latin America, depending on where you're heading to in Latin America. So apart from all of this other stuff, and by the way, we've talked about this before, but it's worth bringing up again. When the Chinese operate, it's often a braided approach. So they'll say, we're here for commercial interests. We're going to help you build a port. There's usually, actually always a strategic component. The port just happens to fit PLA Navy specs. But there's that third element of corruption and criminality that comes along as well. They just happen to, have bought off the right people at that port to smuggle in. Usually, what we focus on mostly now is drugs, but they could be bringing in shoulder-fired missiles, whatever they want, right? Once they've got that whole system set up. And so what the Congresswoman from American Samoa said recently at one of the hearings was she's surrounded on three sides by countries that are very favorable to China, and she's worried about illegal fisheries and all that stuff, but the criminality in places like independent Samoa coming into her country and her part of the country and affecting that their social, economic, and political stability. So yes, it's Latin America, but it's flowing through the Pacific, and it's affecting everything along the way. So when we look at, again, it's a mental map issue. When you look at China in Latin America, that is, again, a Pacific story.
Maybe this will be the last question. You mentioned fisheries. You mentioned these huge fishing fleets that are now reportedly sort of vacuuming up fisheries and the ocean areas, basically everything, impacting, obviously, the traditional fishing communities in many of these islands, as well as giving the Chinese another power projection capability, some armed, some not. What is your attitude towards this aspect of the Chinese unrestricted warfare, how it plays into the political warfare as well? I mean, I think it was Jim Finnell or maybe Colonel Newsom who talked about the influence that these fishing fleet captains might have relative to a four-star admiral, for example. Quickly, just walk us through how that plays into this and the corruption that may emanate from that as well.
First of all, for people in the Pacific Islands, fish have an emotional connection. So if you're in the Federated States of Micronesia, for example, many people belong to clans, and some of those clans are identified by marine animals. So you're a shark clan or you're a stingray clan, whatever it is. And so when the Chinese fisheries do this kind of rapacious sort of fishing, it actually hurts personally And we hear it in Palau also. It's like an ancestor has been ripped from the sea, or a giant clam that you've watched grow for your entire lifetime is suddenly disappears. So there's that emotional connection. But then, of course, obviously it has huge economic effect. And then from a pure Chinese perspective, the fishing fleet can be covered for other activity, as the Filipinos know very well. And so it's just not good. There's nothing good about it. And that's why, again, the Congresswoman from American Samoa has asked for a permanent Coast Guard station in American Samoa. Currently, the Coast Guard, which is great, but severely under equipped. They have, I think it's maybe about half a dozen ships to patrol an area about the size of the continental United States. So somebody once equated it to having half a dozen police cars to patrol the United States, and they only go 30 miles an hour. Right? They need help.